Hi, Tim.
Hi, Bob. How's it going?
I can't complain. Let me introduce this. Uh, I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast, although I think it's also going to be available via your newsletter because of a kind of collaboration thing we're experimenting with that we can talk about. Your newsletter is Understanding AI. You're Timothy B. Lee, and we're going to every month or so do a podcast on AI and see how that goes because I have a very deep interest in that subject.
Absolutely. I'm excited to try this out.
And then we'll and the deal will be, much of it will be publicly available, as is the case with all my pretty much all my podcasts, the lion's share of it, and then the whole thing will be available to paid subscribers of my newsletter and paid subscribers of your newsletter.
That's right.
And you've just gone paid, right? That's a new thing.
Yes. Last week I started asking people to pay, and yeah, there'll be a mix of paid and free content going forward.
Yeah. How's that going? Are you rich?
Not rich yet, but I would say good start. I think it's you just have to hassle people a few times to get them to pay up. So, and I have
Yeah.
to provide value for my subscribers. So this is one of the things I'm experimenting with to figure out,
Yeah.
what my subscribers are interested in and what kind of content they value.
Yeah, no, the formula for success, I think, is like this curve of rising shamelessness in self promotion and even self pity. Sometimes that may work. So there's a number of things we can talk about today, including some things that appear in your newsletter. I hope we'll get to the self driving vehicles, that kind of stuff. But I think we both are in the mood to talk somewhat extensively about the drama at OpenAI. It's been a while since it culminated, but we still haven't seen. I haven't seen a satisfactory kind of comprehensive postmortem, and I'm sure we won't quite achieve a comprehensive one. But I really would like to try to figure out with you exactly what happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the ultimate motivations of the board. I mean, so there was this surprise firing on that Friday, and I think to this day the ultimate motivations of the board are still pretty opaque. There's been a lot of speculation. A lot of people have suggested that fears about excessively rapid, insufficiently cautious development of AI was a big factor. But I mean, it's weird because the board just has the people on the board just haven't talked about it at all, and so
Mm.
we're really reading behind the lines or going based on reports that reporters, people talk to reporters anonymously, and the reporters repeat what they said, but we don't know who's talking to whom, and how much insight they actually have on the decision making process.
Yeah, and in case anyone watching or listening was on another planet, Sam Altman, CEO, was ousted by the board. Then but then he pulled a jujitsu and ousted most of the board, and now he's back. And there was this intervening drama where Microsoft, which owns 49% of OpenAI and provides its compute, kind of weighed in on behalf of Altman's reinstatement, offered him, even said he was now working for Microsoft, along with Greg Brockman, who had been on the board, who had been one of the 6 members of the board, like Sam Altman. Apparently, they weren't invited to all the meetings. And the 4 who wanted them out figured they didn't have to invite everybody to meetings if they knew they had a majority, I guess. I don't know how exactly that worked, but Brockman was demoted from Altman was fired, Brockman quit, and then a growing number of employees signed on, especially after Microsoft kind of signaled that they would be willing to hire anybody from OpenAI and said, if the board doesn't resign, we will, whatever, fall on our swords for Sam. Although actually they just meant we know we can have a secure job with Sam. So that happened. And the standard narrative was this was the very safety conscious people on the board, AI safety conscious. They were kind of identified with effective altruism against Sam Altman, who professes to be concerned about safety, but in fact was more in the Zuckerberg move fast and break things mode. That was the standard narrative, that was the nature of concern. But as you say, we still don't know. And in fact, Ezra Klein weighed in yesterday on Threads with this. He said, one thing in the OpenAI story I'm now fully convinced of is it's consistent in my interviews on both sides. This was not about safety. It was not about commercialization. It was not about speed of development or releases. It was not about Q-Star. Q-Star is this supposedly important functionality that OpenAI hasn't unveiled yet. And then Ezra goes on, it was really a pure fight over control. The board felt it couldn't trust Altman. It felt Altman could and would outmaneuver them in a pinch, but he wasn't outmaneuvering them on X issue. They just felt they couldn't govern him. Does that make sense to you as an adequate explanation?
Yeah, I mean, I think two things I would add. You said that Microsoft owns 49% of OpenAI. An important caveat to that is that OpenAI has a complicated structure where there's a nonprofit board that's ultimately in charge, and then it has a subsidiary it's a for-profit operation. Microsoft owned 49% of the subsidiary, but it didn't have a board seat. It didn't have any actual. That 49% was almost notional because normally if you own almost half of a company, you get 1 or 2 board seats. They got 0 board seats. They had no actual control. And I think a big factor was just this was a very small, very inexperienced board. I think there's just not people. I mean, Sam Altman, previous to being an OpenAI, was the president of Y Combinator, which is like the best known startup accelerator, which means that he has been involved. And so anytime Y Combinator accepts somebody into one of their classes, they get an investment. So he's been an investor in like literally hundreds of companies. He's been involved in lots of like boardroom fights and investor discussions. And so he's just a very savvy operator. And I think the board is made up of much less experienced people. And so I think they were just not prepared to oversee a organization that was as large and fast growing and prominent as OpenAI is. And so I think they just made some rookie mistakes. And I'm sure there's a case that Sam Altman is a difficult person to control. And Ezra's reporting, I'm sure, is much better than mine. So I'm going to defer to him on what he said there. But I think part of the dynamic might be that that the people on the board felt they had a responsibility to control him, and he is hard to control. And they just kind of freaked out, and they're like, we don't feel like we're able to do our job, which is to keep this safe. And we're not comfortable with the way Sam is behaving. And they maybe imagined they could just fire Sam and that would be the end of it. And didn't really, because they maybe didn't have as much experience operating on kind of high stakes boards, didn't game out like, okay, we fire him, what happens next? And obviously what happens next is like really bad for both them and OpenAI. But maybe they just didn't think it through carefully enough.
Well, I would be a little harder on the board. I don't have much experience with boards, but I would have gamed it out further than they did, I think.
Sure.
It's like they didn't give Microsoft a heads up until a minute before. And of course, as you say, they had no technical obligation to, because it's this odd thing where they are running a nonprofit and their stated mission, their mandate is to do good things that are good for humankind. So, it's a little more narrowly specified that in the sense that it's focused on AI, but they're not supposed to be concerned with like maximizing shareholder value, which there isn't any in the sense of public shareholders, right? And their mission isn't to maximize investor value. So it is this super strange thing, and you can argue that they were doing their job. I think maybe they were. And they were doing it in a naive way and didn't think things through. That's all true. But the reason I think there must be more to the story than Ezra is saying is like there's 2 sides of this story. I mean, there's two kinds. I would think broadly, there's mainly 2 kinds of sources. There's the kind on Sam's side. And of course, they want to say he wasn't taking any ridiculous risks. And then there's the board side. And there's only like 3 people who know what the truth is there. Are they talking to Ezra? And if they are, do they want to tell him the truth? I don't know. I guess if they're talking to him, I mean, if they wanted the story out that it was safety issues, we'd have heard it by now. So I don't I'm not sure it's very easy for somebody in his position to get both sides of the story.
Mhm.
And it just seems the idea that they had this abstract concern and no specific things they griped to each other about, if that's what he's saying, I mean, he's not quite saying that, because even in his account, there must be instances where Altman like deceived him a little or shaded the truth. I just think there must have been one of those that had some actual consequence and was relevant to the question of how fast OpenAI proceeds and how careful it is, right? I mean, I just don't think it was this
I mean,
generic concern.
so one thing to note is that this happened about a week and a half after OpenAI had its demo day, or its
Yeah.
developer day, which is a big day when they announce some new products. They're focused on their APIs, which is the interface that developers use to build third-party products based on OpenAI's technology. And that's something where it really creates kind of a lock-in for OpenAI from a mission perspective, because once they're not only offering ChatGPT as a product to consumers, but also providing a platform that lots of other people are using to build their software, it would be very disruptive for OpenAI to later say, oh, like, we're going too fast, we're going to cut off functionality, we're going to change our focus.
Mm-hmm.
And it would not surprise to me if, Sam Altman, gave the board a misleading impression of what was going to be announced at that, maybe said things at his keynote that went farther than the board expected. I mean, I don't know the specifics, but I could imagine a situation where over a course of months, the board members would ask Sam kind of what's going on, what's going to happen, and they keep being surprised by him doing things publicly that were different from what he had told them privately. Maybe in subtle ways that are like difficult to prove very specifically. I mean, I think Sam is a pretty savvy operator, and so he may have said things that were technically true, but gave the board a misleading impression, said different things to different board members. I mean, I don't know. This is just
Right.
speculation, but that's the sort of thing I can imagine where it wouldn't be any of given the magnitude of what happened for OpenAI. Maybe the things that in retrospect seem pretty small and would be hard to kind of justify as like, this is the reason we fired him. But you add up a bunch of things, just created this like increasing
Right.
level of mistrust. The other like person I think we really have to talk to is Ilya Sutskever, who was kind of the star scientist of OpenAI,
Right.
has a board seat, was one of the founding scientists, and I think he was really the reason the board was able to make this move, because there's six
Right.
members, as you said. There are three external board members, and 3 employees. And so if Ilya had stuck with his colleagues, the other 3 would not have had a majority for whatever they wanted to do. And there was an article in the Atlantic suggesting that his thinking had been, as OpenAI had made progress, the progress was faster than Sutskever expected, and that he believes that OpenAI is getting close to AGI, whatever that is, and then that made him more nervous about the lack of safety controls, the lack of focus on safety. I believe that that Sutskever was put in charge of the super alignment project that OpenAI announced a
Mm-hmm.
few months ago to put 20% of their compute budget towards safety research, basically. Anyway, the claim from this Atlantic article was that Sutskever thought OpenAI was close to having transformational AI, that Sam was not paying enough attention to the safety dimensions, and we don't know exactly what the trigger is, but sometime in the few days before the flip, he kind of made up his mind that he didn't think Sam was going in the direction, and went to the other board members and kind of suggested they fire him. This is the interesting thing is then by the end of the weekend, he had flipped sides and said he was very sorry he'd done this, and wanted to make it right and wanted Sam back. So that obviously doesn't reflect well on him. I mean, whichever side you think is right, like that kind of flipping sides very
Yeah.
quickly. So that's not a good look for him. But that makes me think there probably was a sort of safety element, because
Mm-hmm.
just from the reporting, it seemed like that was
Well,
kind of what he cared
yeah.
about.
Now, one could come up with a more cynical explanation for his initial opposition to Altman, which is, I mean, first of all, the safety thing would make sense as Sutskever's motivation, and I think it probably was some of it. He's a kind of a protege of Jeffrey Hinton, and Hinton, sometimes identified a bit misleadingly, perhaps, as the godfather of AI, is one of these people who has the concern about the superintelligence, the
Yeah.
sci-fi concern. And that's a concern, as you said, about artificial general intelligence, per se. And Sitzkever has some of that. At the same time, to get back to the cynical explanation, look, he's the guy more responsible than anybody else at the company, I assume, for the amazingness of ChatGPT. He's the chief scientist. He's the genius they hired. Who gets all the credit? Sam Altman. Who's out there? Sam Altman. Does Sam Altman very often mention Ilya? I haven't heard it. I've heard him maybe once or twice, but he doesn't go out of his way to shower credit on him. And I assume Ilya Sutskever is human. And that's exactly the kind of thing that can build up and be an influence. I'm not saying it's the only influence, but I think it shouldn't be.
I'm skeptical of that. I mean, I do think in the AI community, I mean, that he's fundamentally a scientist. In the circles he runs in, he's a very, very prominent person. I think everybody knows that he's the guy technically. So I'm sure like everybody would like more credit and time in the limelight, but I wouldn't get the sense that he would feel he was sort of not getting proper credit or getting slighted because like he mostly cares about. I would assume he would care most about what other sort of AI researchers know, and every AI researcher knows who he is and what he's accomplished. I mean, partly because he had, as you said, he's a protege of Jeffrey Hinton. He was a co-author on the original AlexNet paper in 2012 that sort of kicked off the deep learning revolution. So he was already a very prominent person before OpenAI came along. He was, I think he's widely acknowledged as the co-founder of OpenAI. So, I mean, like I said, I haven't talked to the guy. I don't know what his motivations are, but at a very bit, I would say it was more than that. Like that.
It had to be. I think it was more than that. Yeah. But little things matter. Another little thing is, apparently, one of the board members, Helen Toner, this former board members, who, and to get back to the whole effective altruism narrative, which dominated the initial postmortems, she is at an organization that is supported by Open Philanthropy. I think maybe she was at Open Philanthropy. And Open Philanthropy is, among other things, a very AI safety conscious thing. It supports the nonprofit she's on at Georgetown. It has a connection to the other board member who was not very prominent in the discussion, but the other woman on the board who was also no longer on the board. Yeah. And that's one reason that, this narrative emerged, that this was about safety. But the other reason, well, there are a lot of reasons, and I think you can make the case that it was substantially about safety, probably, but she had written a thing. Did you look at her paper that Altman apparently complained about? She had written a paper that basically said, it was ostensibly an academic paper about how corporations can send signals, but it basically said Anthropic is being more careful than OpenAI. Now, by the way, Anthropic, this was Sam Altman's first big brush with the safety issue at OpenAI when a bunch of employees said he wasn't concerned enough about OpenAI. Some of them are aligned with the effective altruism movement, which I want to talk about because I think that whole thing is being misunderstood. But anyway, they went and started Anthropic, which is now a powerhouse. It's now one of the big four, big five in America. So anyway, apparently Altman went and complained to her about what she had written. Now, that's really stepping out of line because, as you say, this isn't a conventional board. If it's a conventional board and she has written something that's going to hurt shareholder value, fine. But her mission is to call them as she sees them. She's she's on the board of a nonprofit, and he comes and tells her what she should and shouldn't say publicly about her mission. Now, that is him overstepping his bounds, given the way this whole thing is structured, right?
Yeah, but I also think, I think this goes back to the point that whether it's about safety or not is not like a clear-cut thing, because on the one hand, from his perspective, he just sees it as kind of a matter of, even a nonprofit board, it's a little weird for a nonprofit to publish an article saying that the organization I'm a part of is behaving. I don't necessarily think he should tell her to stop, but the normal way you deal with that is internally. If you have a well-functioning board, you raise concerns internally. But anyway, you can see from his perspective, it was just kind of a matter of etiquette within an organization. You keep your kind of complaints inside, whereas from her perspective, it was about safety. You can frame it in either way, and I think that Sam Altman kind of wanted to have a lot of autonomy and kind of do his thing, and the board wanted to oversee it, partly because they felt the safety. But it's like I think it's like almost like just two ways of looking at the same basic disagreement.
Yeah, but well, I want to say two things. First of all, yeah, it's a weird thing for a board member of a nonprofit to do. On the other hand, it's extremely rare for a nonprofit's mission to be to in effect criticize and correct its own subsidiary, right?
Yeah.
That just it's a weird setup. But she was doing what she's supposed to do, and he was, I'm sure, from her point of view, being very annoying. And what I wanted to say is it gets back to how closely related like personal irritations can be. Like that's going to piss her off at a personal level. If he had said, I don't think your hair looks good, it would have pissed her off. Like whatever, But as it happens, this was a safety issue, and so that's one reason to disentangle the. But another reason, I think this had to be to some extent about safety is it a coincidence that this happened? Well, it happened after two things. It happened after, as you said, this big like developer conference where, again, OpenAI seemed to be proceeding full speed ahead. And we should say that is what Altman has seemed to do, right? He early on, OpenAI, they opened up their API to, well, first of all, to plugin maker, people wanted to make plugins that would accelerate the dissemination of AI technology, and also a kind of API that would let corporations, people with a lot of money come in and use their own training data or something I don't totally understand. But that was a kind of accelerationist move. And then this big developer conference, as you said, it not only opened up new opportunities to developers, it in a certain sense turns all of us into developers, right? They unveiled these bots that you can customize, possibly in ways that would allow you to increase your company's productivity and fire people. If you're just like a mom and pop shop, I can imagine customizing one of these bots that accelerates the displacement of workers. And my question is like, so anyway, this happened right after that, and also right after something else we can get to. But you tell me, how could Sam Altman have gone any slower over the last 2 years than he's gone? He comes to Congress and says he's concerned, but what is he actually doing? I mean, I'm sure the part of the answer is part of their budget goes to safety, and there's people working on it. But I mean, in terms of rollout, he's like Mark Zuckerberg, so far as I can tell. It's like let's just go forward.
Yeah, I actually think it's interesting to step back further. So if you look at the overall history of OpenAI, they've been around since 2015, and they started experimenting with the GPT, 1, 2, 3, 4, around 2018. And when they released GPT-2, they actually didn't release it. They published some papers about it, but said we're not going to make this available to anybody because we're worried it's too dangerous. And that was a change because previously they their original mission was going to open source everything. Like that's the way to make public benefit. When GPT-2 came out, which was not nearly as good as ChatGPT, they said, "Ooh, like this is like advanced enough that we're worried about misinformation, blah blah blah, so we're not going to release it." And so I was actually surprised. Like I'd been sort of following that at the time. I was surprised when GPT-3 and 3.5 and ChatGPT came out that they were so public about it, because this was an even more powerful model. And I don't feel like they've ever fully explained why they did that. And what I think they would say if you asked them was that, look, somebody's going to build these models, and it's better to have a nonprofit that's concerned with these issues do it than Google or the Chinese government or something, and that it's important for the public to understand the capabilities so that we can make good policy, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I agree. Like the rush to commercialize it in the most extensive, fastest way possible is a little hard to square with that mission. And I assume it's just because this is what Sam Altman does, right? Again, he was at Y Combinator before this, and and his big thing when he was advising startups is how can you be more ambitious? That's his whole thing was helping startup founders with pretty promising ideas become these massive companies like Google or Facebook. And it seems like he just talked himself into that being consistent with the mission, even though it's not. It doesn't seem, it seems hard to square with the way OpenAI behaved in its first few years.
Yeah. Well, there's, I think he has a kind of answer he would give that I want to get to when we talk about your own doubts about how grave a threat AI is, because you've written about
Sure.
that uh, recently in your newsletter. But I also want to say well, I mean, I guess there's one other thing he had done that I personally find annoying, and I don't know if the board did, but he had kind of hinted a couple times that they've got some super powerful thing in the closet. It's going to blow your mind. And, he did it in an interview with Lorene Powell Jobs, and he did it some other time. And my view is, look, I mean, obviously that's good for him. It gives him this kind of mystique. I'm the one who knows the secret. And that's why I just find it annoying as shit. Look, when you're ready to disclose it, disclose it. Until then, you know, you know, cut it with the I know something you don't know act. I just find that extremely annoying. And I don't know if any board members did, but what's your take? Are you not annoyed?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to the weirdness of their structure. I mean, the problem they had was they started as a nonprofit board. Elon Musk was just giving them a bunch of money, and so they could just be a nonprofit and pursue their mission, and Elon Musk would just kind of give them unconditional money. When Elon Musk left around 2018, they wanted to keep operating, and in particular, they were finding that to make a really powerful AI, you need to make it larger and larger. You need more and more compute budget, and so they needed more money, and there was no way they're going to raise billions of dollars from philanthropic sources. And so they convinced themselves that the thing to do was to take money from Microsoft, and but that then obviously changes the incentives, and now Sam is on the startup treadmill where he needs to OpenAI is not profitable. I think this was one of the big underlying dynamics of the that weekend was that OpenAI did not have the option to kind of go back to being a regular nonprofit because they were losing a ton of money, and the premise was they're going to keep raising money, but they're going to grow this giant, like Google-sized business that then will eventually be profitable. They needed several more years of venture capital, and that gave Microsoft a ton of leverage. And I think that's a big reason why you saw. I mean, Sam Altman is kind of in marketing mode, right? I mean, he's
Yeah.
acting like a startup founder because he has to act like that because he needs Microsoft to write him a big check again in a year or two, and it's just a really, I think it was, I'm not sure it was like a viable balance to strike where you kind of can't serve two masters.
Hmm. Um, the I have one question about the future of this board, but do you have anything else to say about kind of what we think happened? Again, I think there was a safety issue possibly intermingled with some issues of personal friction and just maybe a general kind of he's quite an operator, and I don't think we can trust him. But I do think that was like working in synergy with safety concerns, I would guess. But that's my theory. Is there any postmortem wrap up you want to do before we talk about a little bit? I want to talk about the future of the board, and Larry Summers is a kind of important role.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly Larry Summers is God. But is there anything
Yeah, no, I mean, my guess is the independent directors were probably annoyed, but didn't necessarily feel like they were empowered to do that much about it. And so when Ilya had whatever epiphany he had and came to the board and said, "Oh, I'm concerned too now," the they realized they had a majority to do what they wanted to do, and they decided what they wanted to do is fire Sam Altman. And it may have come up suddenly enough that they didn't think it through, and maybe felt like maybe the moment would pass, so they didn't want to. Obviously, as you said before, the smart thing to do would have been bring Microsoft in, maybe give Sam a warning saying we need X, Y, and Z, or we're going to fire you.
yeah,
But maybe they felt
yeah.
because it was kind of a tenuous majority, they foolishly thought, oh, we should like strike while the iron's hot, and didn't think it through. So it was really just like, obviously, the major screw up. Like whatever you think on the merits, the way they did it tactically was very bad, and like they, the results kind of speak for
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah. Now, so quickly, so the reconstituted board, which was a compromise, I guess, between the Altman faction and the board members who didn't have to step down, right? I mean, and in order to get them to agree to do that, Altman had to make some concessions, and I guess one concession was leaving one of them on the board who had voted against him, the Quora founder, Adam D'Angelo, And then they brought in a guy named Brett something, who's apparently respected in Silicon Valley, had been at Salesforce or something. And he, I think, is an Altman ally, although he's kind of widely respected and liked, I guess, but he seems to be an Altman ally. And then they brought in Larry Summers. Now, there's only 3 board members. They can't add board members without 2 votes. So I would think this puts Larry Summers in a very important position. As they build the board, he's presumably going to be a kind of a swing vote. And my question to you is, he's a guy with a whole history. And of course, people know the irony. They fire the 2 women on the board, or they get them to agree to step down, and they hire Larry Summers, who had to leave step down as president of Harvard, basically because he said women are genetically not, or speculate at least a reason that women might be genetically unfit, unbalanced to be good at science and technology. But anyway, that irony aside, he's a politico, he's an operator, he's been in administrations. My own personal concern is that I think he's more or less connected to the blob on foreign policy. And my question to you is, should this worry me the way it would worry me if it were a powerful media organization? In a way, I think it should worry me more. And I can explain why. But, should I have the concerns about the ideology of the swing voter as I would if it were the New York Times or something? That's my question.
You mean in terms of his views
Power.
on sort of foreign policy or economic policy, or
just whether it could matter in the future? Like, assume that let's assume he's thinking about that and wants to further his ideology. If this were the New York Times, you'd go, well, yeah, that matters if he's the swing vote, and is going to build up the board, and they're going to hire the people who put the newspaper out. Should I think there's a scenario in which this should concern me in somewhat the same way, but I'm not sure about it. Does it seem?
I mean, it is absolutely the case that an organization like OpenAI has part of what they do is they make moderation decisions. Decisions about basically the ideology of the chatbot personas that they do. I mean, a product like ChatGPT has to decide certain questions we're not going to answer, and they have those decisions are going to be ideologically inflected. I mean, one example is if you ask ChatGPT to write a poem praising Hitler, it will refuse because Hitler's beyond the pale. But you can kind of play a game where you think of different kind of controversial global figures, Vladimir Putin, or and you can kind of figure out the ideology of the people who created the product based on who they consider kind of beyond the pale. And anyway, so I can definitely see in the long run he would have some impact on that. I think it would be hard for a board to steer that too precisely, because the people actually making those decisions are going to be several levels below Sam Altman in the hierarchy.
Yeah.
And so I think at the margin it certainly matters, but I think it's that's kind of a long-term thing where, yeah, absolutely. If OpenAI becomes has the power to shape in the same way that Facebook, I mean, certainly who's on the Facebook board is going to matter, because Facebook makes moderation decisions that swing elections and stuff. So yeah, I think that's a concern, but I think that's more of a long-term concern. In the short term, it's more about, how he feels about the pace of commercialization, and, I mean, it's hard to say what's going to come up, but more kind of AI specific concerns that are not, I think, primarily ideological in the kind of regular political sense.
Yeah, but see, I think the ideology can manifest itself more subtly than, can you, will it say nice things about Hitler or something? It's like, I'll give you an example. I was just curious. I asked it, why did Bill Clinton decide to expand NATO? And I didn't ask it, what did he say? It would be naive to answer the question about why a politician did something by just saying what he said. But that's what it did. It just said, well, he wanted to spread democracy. He wanted to do this. And, I know the actual story. There was heavy lobbying by the arms industry, and he wanted to get votes from people of Eastern European ancestry in the Midwest for the election. That is fairly well documented to be important. But when I said, why did he do it? But let me finish.
Sure.
If you drill down you could eventually get at it. First, it said, well, he did it in order to this, and a bunch of bullshit. And then I said, well, what about, was he interested in getting, like, did the arms lobbyists play? Well, blah, blah, blah. And what about Polish American voters and wherever? Well, blah, blah, blah. And so it's in there. But what I want to say is, like, there's two things that matter in terms of what it's going to tell you. What is the training data? Does Larry Summers say, no, we don't want truth dig, and we don't want counterpunch, and we don't want this and that in the training data? That is going to be a very important question, because for certain of these things, it's hard to find the truth in, like, the New York Times, and questions very much like the one I just asked. Actually, you can dig in the deep archives and get the truth there, maybe. But and then the second thing is reinforcement learning, the round of human feedback, which I think is of underrated importance in making these things as impressive as they are. And in selecting that group of the reinforcers, that's the other big lever of influence. And if you accept the idea that some of the people concerned about safety have, and this isn't really the sci-fi concern, but that, we may grow to rely on these things just like the way we rely on the most trusted human being in our life. That doesn't seem to me crazy that they'll become that influential. Then in that case, this matters, right? So that's the context of my question.
No, I absolutely think that those are fundamentally editorial decisions. Those decisions matter at an organizational level. I think the question is how much does a board member have influence over that versus how much of it kind of the staff having autonomy. And the thing about, so absolutely, if you took ChatGPT and you took out all of the sources from a particular perspective out of the training data, that's going to skew the training data away from that perspective. But I think the approach OpenAI has taken is kind of put everything in, and over time they'll try to take stuff out. But I think it's more going to be like we're going to take out, like, spam farms and like neo-Nazi stuff. Like, I think all the sort of broadly mainstream stuff is going to be in there, and even a lot of the non-mainstream stuff. And I think that it's probably just going to be such a long list that Larry Summers is not going to have time to, like, go through that's going to be a staff decision. So no, I think it absolutely matters, but I think it'll be a while before they have, frankly, the bandwidth to make those kind of fine-grained decisions. Right now, I think it's just throw everything in the pile, and and the architecture might change to the point where maybe the training data isn't important, or different sources matter more. So it's hard to say. So I agree in the abstract it's important. I just think it'll be probably a few years before you would see any kind of any like noticeable difference in its output based on somebody like Larry Summers being on the board.
And I should add, the factors I mentioned about NATO expansion, you can find those in, like, The Nation, which is a little closer to the mainstream, but well, look, at a minimum,
I don't think it's like whether it's in there or not, it's the preponderance of the evidence. So even if you have all those sources in there, but you have 100 more conventional sources, New York Times, and maybe it decides the New York Times is like a higher quality one, so it gives it more weight. It's like, I don't think it's a question of whether something's in there or not. It's a question of what is kind of the weight of the sources. And so if most sources, by most definitions, have a particular perspective, the chatbot's going to give that answer, even if there's alternative answers somewhere in its training set.
Right. But that's why I think it matters. And I do think, I'm sure it has happened in the history of media, certainly, that there's a CEO and they're deciding, and the CEO, he or she leaves, they're deciding who to hire next. And people on the board are mindful of the ideology of the CEO. So even though the board doesn't make that decision, I really think, I think this is one of the things people should be very concerned about. And at a minimum, they should be transparent about their training data. We don't know what GPT was trained on, right?
Yeah.
I think that's
certainly not the current
I think
version.
that's inexcusable.
No, absolutely. No, I think this is actually, so that's a good point. Like, the board's power comes from its power to choose the CEO. Sam Altman is going to be a strong CEO, and he might be there for another 30 years, in which case it probably won't matter that much who's on the board, because Sam is just going to do what he does. But certainly if Sam were to leave, or if the board gets a lot of leverage over Sam, then that could it could matter more who the board is. So yeah, so and like, obviously if Larry is picking the other board members, that can create a kind of permanent influence where the board is permanently has a particular perspective, and then eventually when Sam leaves. So yeah, I agree. It definitely matters. I just think it'll be a while before it's really noticeable.
So, here's what I think, and this is a good segue to your skepticism of the kind of sci-fi doomer scenarios where superintelligence squashes us all. I think what Altman would say if you said, you claim you're concerned about safety, but you're moving pretty fast. And I should say, I know somebody who knows Altman very well, has worked very closely with him, and says he is actually concerned about the safety issues. This is somebody who I trust to read him, write, and to tell me the truth about his reading of him. And
I have no doubt of that.
And I think what he would say is, and I've seen hints of this, and it's tied in with the sci-fi superintelligence idea. There seems to be this idea in that community, the hardcore sci-fi doomers, that like there's some kind of magic alignment formula, and if we can discover it, we can make these AIs nice or something, and it's almost like a plug-in or something. It's like, and I think Altman would say, if we remain at the head of the pack and we are concerned and we are devoting all this money to finding the magic friendliness plug-in or something, we can be the ones who show the world how to create an aligned AI and, make it and promulgate it, because we'll be the head of the pack. Does it make sense to you that that's kind of what he's thinking?
It's more than that. I mean, if you read Nick Bostrom, whose book Superintelligence sort of, I think, is the seminal influence on this topic, like his view is that the first superintelligent AI that's created will be so powerful that it'll be capable of taking over the world. And so if you're the one that creates that, it's going to have your values or potentially have your values. And so the most important thing is to have that first version be created correctly. And so I think in Sam's mind, somebody's going to create that. He's smart, he's capable, he's concerned about AI, and so he's going to he wants to get there first so that his super alignment team can put the right, like you said, the right friendliness plugin in. And it kind of doesn't matter what anybody else does, because if they get there first, then it will. And it's a little like, it's really frustrating when you read Nick Bostrom. He has like 2 pages where he says what's going to happen is it'll become super intelligent and it'll invent this like magical nanotechnology thing that'll spread all over the world, and basically like God, it can just do whatever it wants. And I'm not sure that's even like physically possible. I find that very, very implausible. But like that's the only scenario he really talks about. And so the exact mechanism of like how having the most powerful AI leads to taking over the world is unclear. But anyway, that's their view, I think, is that this is inevitable. The first one's going to be very powerful, and if we can make that one nice, that will then create a lot of leverage to make sure no bad ones emerge. Like the nice superintelligence will be able to prevent any evil superintelligence from emerging, and so they want to get there and do it first.
Mm-hmm. And part of this is this idea that there really is this clear threshold to AGI. You'll know it. Artificial general intelligence is this kind of platonic ideal. It's not just some kind of arbitrary marker on a gradient of progress, right?
Yeah, because the idea is once you have one AGI, you can make 1 million of them, and then you can have this scientific research team that one of the things they can do is do research to make itself more smarter. And so once you have it at human level, you can very quickly get above human level, and there's this, they call it an intelligence explosion, where it gets smarter and smarter, and soon it's like so far above humans that we don't even understand what it's doing, and it can move much faster than us and take over the world. And so there's this idea that intelligence is this very like one-dimensional thing where we're at a 120 IQ, or we're at 100 150 IQ, but there's like a 500 IQ or a 10,000 IQ that like we can't even think of because our brains aren't big enough. And if you believe that, then yeah, it makes sense that thing will be very powerful, and it really, really matters like what the first instance of it, what it's like.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, maybe this is a good point to well, actually, no, that reminds me. Before I say bring down the paywall, that made me think of the phrase bring down the veil of ignorance. And I want to ask you, so I was thinking about writing a little item about how Sam Altman had used the term veil of ignorance, and he kind of misused it in a way that I think is actually, you could argue, is a little bit telling. So here's a question I have. I was more, well, I was kind of a liberal. I was a social science major. So I'm aware of the actual origin of the term veil of ignorance. And I guess it's not that widely known, maybe outside of the humanities and to some extent.
I couldn't tell you what the
Okay, well, this is interesting then, because Altman said in one of these things where he was teasing us and like he knows this secret. He said, I'll just say, you know, there was recent within the last few months or something, I had one of those moments where we push back the veil of ignorance and see, you know, what lies ahead, or, you know, and basically he was taking it to mean things we don't know, the veil of ignorance. And the actual origin of the term is with the philosopher John Rawls, and it's probably the most influential piece of liberal moral philosophy of the past half century, I would say, Rawlsianism.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And so the veil of ignorance is like, if you were, the way you should think about setting up a society is you don't know which person you're going to be in the society. Okay. And like, yeah, right now you're Sam Altman, you're privileged, and you're going to be doing fine if AI makes $1 billion. But Rawls would say, you know, and this is a kind of extension of utilitarianism, I would say, or could be used that way, which is, of course, the philosophy of the EAs, the effective altruists, which Altman is not one of, but he probably is utilitarian. Anyway, it's an extension of utilitarianism that, in effect, adds a dimension of kind of egalitarianism, because you could be any of those people, and you have to decide what the ideal society is, what the ideal distribution power is, and so on, without assuming you'll be as privileged as you are. And it was just interesting to me because, like, that's a way of phrasing what the board's critique of him might be. You're not thinking enough the way Rawls wants you to think. And it's just interesting that he demonstrated that he doesn't seem to know what this whole thing. It's just kind of ironic. It's one of these little things that it would be unfair to make a big deal of, and yet it could be the basis for a decent column, basically.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So actually, I had read Rawls, so I'm definitely familiar with it. It just didn't occur to me that was the same. That seemed like a totally different sense. But yeah, I see what you mean there. Yeah, I mean, one of the things you'll hear people in kind of this superintelligence world will say is that one of the first things I want to ask superintelligence is like explain the like fundamentals of physics to them. And I think this is like this is the kind of point I made in my piece, is like I think people in this world have this impression that like intelligence is the main thing you need to solve kind of all problems in the world. And for me, like I think to find out kind of fundamental physics, you need to do things like build particle accelerators, right? Like you can have lots of theories, like people have, you know, they have string theory, and I don't know, there's lots of other theories out there. The problem is that they're not falsifiable until you like do some experiments, and those experiments are hard to do. And like I see that as one of the fundamental like divides here, is that if you think like intelligence is the be all and end all, then if you get more and more intelligence, you know, become very powerful. Whereas I think it's more like a lot of aspects of the world are really controlled by having the right knowledge and the right infrastructure. And you know, being intelligent certainly helps. It lets you get those other things a little faster. But being super intelligent doesn't help you if you don't have the ability to kind of go out in the world and try things and see what happens as a result.
Yeah. Okay, so now we can bring down the paywall of ignorance. You don't know what's on the other side, but we will give you these clues. First of all, you can access it by becoming a paid subscriber either to my Nonzero newsletter or to your Understanding AI newsletter. And of course, you can become an unpaid subscriber to both if you know the gateway drug. We hope, and you'll get content in both. You know, obviously more content one way than the other, but we encourage both. And I guess what we can talk about to give them a clue of what lies on the other side of the paywall of ignorance is I want to, you have this whole skepticism about AGI that's in a way greater than or different from my skepticism. I think we'll probably get to amazing heights. But I still don't, I'm still skeptical of the sci-fi doomerism, or at least I don't quite understand it. Anyway, you're skeptical at a deeper level. Talk about that. If we have time, I'll talk a little more about effective altruism and what it, how I think it's been kind of a little warped in the coverage of this. And then you have a whole thing about like self-driving cars you've written about lately. I want to learn more about that. Get your take on that. Okay, so anything you want to say before we head into overtime?
No.
Aside from please support us. Okay, so we're heading into overtime.